In this video, we're going to talk about how to solve quadratic equations using the methods we've discussed. So let's solve now x squared minus 10x plus 16 equals 0 by graphing. So to do this, I'm going to go to Desmos and I'm going to enter this as y equals x squared minus 10x plus 16. And then to find the solutions, I'm going to look for the x-intercepts of this graph. So remember, the x-intercepts occur where the graph crosses the x-axis. This graph crosses the x-axis twice. It crosses at 2, 0 and 8, 0. So that means that this quadratic equation has two solutions, x equals 2 and x equals 8. So now let's solve x squared plus 6x plus 8 equals 0 by factoring. So remember, when you're factoring, you're going to look for the value of a and see if it equals 1 or if it does not equal 1. In this case, a equals 1, so I can just look at the value of c. In this case, c is 8. So I'm going to look for factors of 8. And they need to have a sum that's equal to my b value, which is 6. So I'm going to go ahead and create my table now. So the factors of 8 are 1 and 8 and 2 and 4. Since 8 is positive and 6 is positive, all of my factors are going to be positive. 1 plus 8 is equal to 9. 2 plus 4 is equal to 6, so that's the pair that works. So this is going to factor into x plus 2 times x plus 4 is equal to 0. So now we can use a zero product property to set each factor equal to 0 and solve for x. So we have x plus 2 equals 0 and x plus 4 equals 0. So now let's solve these equations for x. So here we're going to subtract 2 from both sides. And when we subtract 2 from both sides, we get x equals negative 2. Okay, so that's our first solution. And then over here, we're going to subtract 4 from both sides. And when we do that, we get x equals negative 4. So that's our second solution. So that's how you solve by factoring. So now let's try solving this equation using square roots. So notice that square roots will work to solve this quadratic equation because I have a square term that can be isolated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to isolate that term in my very first step. So I have x squared plus 4 equals 28. So to isolate that square, I need to subtract 4 from both sides. So when I subtract 4 from both sides, that gives me x squared equals 28 minus 4, which is 24. So now I'm going to go ahead and take the square root of both sides. So I have the square root of x squared equals plus or minus the square root of 24. So remember, I need to work on simplifying that square root. Well, the square root of x squared is just going to be x. And then when I simplify this, well, I can factor out a 4, right? So that's going to be plus or minus the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. So the square root of 4 is 2, so this is going to give me x equals plus or minus 2 times the square root of 6. And that's how you can solve this equation using square roots. So now let's solve 6x squared plus 3 equals 11x using the quadratic formula. Remember, when I'm using the quadratic formula, I can do that by going ahead and setting the equation equal to 0. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 11x from both sides. And so that's going to give me 6x squared minus 11x plus 3 equals 0. Okay, I wrote the terms in this order because I want it to be in standard form. So 6 is now my value of a, negative 11 is b, and c is 3. So I'm just going to list that out. We have a equals 6, b equals negative 11, and c equals 3. So when we plug into the quadratic formula, remember we want to start off by looking at the discriminant. So we have d equals b squared minus 4ac. That gives us d equals b, which is negative 11. So we have negative 11 squared minus 4 times a, which is 6, times c, which is 3. So we have d equals negative 11 squared, which is 121, minus 4 times 6 times 3, which is 72. 121 minus 72 is equal to 49. So now let's go ahead and plug into the quadratic formula. So we have x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of the discriminant, which is 49, divided by 2 times 6. So we have x equals negative 11 is 11, and then plus or minus the square root of 49, which is 7, and that's all divided by 12. So this is going to separate into two solutions. We have 11 plus 7 over 12, which is going to be 18 over 12. And then let's go ahead and reduce this because both of these terms are divisible by 6. So we have 3 and then we have 2. So this is just going to turn into 3 over 2, which you can also write as 1.5. So then we have our other solution for x. So we have x equals 11 minus 7 over 12. 11 minus 7 is 4 over 12. And let's go ahead and reduce this. This 4 will become 1, and then 12 will become 3. So that is going to turn into 1 over 3. So we have x equals 1/3 and x equals 3 over 2 as our two solutions. So you can use several methods to solve quadratic equations in standard form, which is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Depending on the equation and the values of a, b, and c, you can choose the best method to use.